For some reason, it has your name on this. Why does it have your name on this? Now it's
Wait, I changed something?
reason it has your name on this. Why does it have my name on it? I don't. It has a delay built into it too. I have no idea. Let's see. It's this, and then I've got to close that. And
Did I change something?
I don't know. I got an echo in here too. God damn it.
I'll cut my sound here.
Has a delay built into it too. I have no idea. Let's see. It's this, and then I'm gonna close that. I don't know. Got an echo in here too. God damn it.
I'll cut my sound.
Delay built into it too. I have no idea. Let's see. It's this, and then I'm gonna close that. I don't know. Got an echo in here too. God damn it.
I see the live.
Alternative universe. The alternative universe is operating.
Yeah. I see the live.
Alternative universe. The alternative universe is operating. Hang in there.
Okay.
Alternative universe. The alternative universe is operating. Hang in there.
Yeah.
Well, it's like a 30-second delay. That's very funky. It's like a 30.
Is that like, I guess, the typical YouTube delay?
Hang in there. Well, it's very like a 30-second delay. That's very funky. Testing 1, 2, 3. No, there's only 2 people here.
I guess the typical YouTube delay.
Well, I know I'm supposed to shut a window. It's a 30-second delay. Let me shut this. That should fix it. All righty.
Oh yeah, it sounds better, I think, now.
I'm such an idiot. All righty. There we go. Share sound, optimize, share. All right, here we go. Well, I'm going to just start reading. It's the 16th September. I'm going to read chapters 6 and 7 from Hudson's book. And I know it'll sound boring, but I'd like to think that the Sunday session with Class Unity helped to introduce some of these ideas, and ultimately we're going to catch up with the issue of trying to complete or do a significant number of chapters, I think up to 14 in the Hudson book. So we're up to 6. Rentiers sponsor rent-free national income statistics. The people of Goldman Sachs are among the most productive in the world. Lloyd Blankfein, Goldman Sachs chief executive, November 10th, 2009. The question is, productive of what? To Goldman Sachs, it's productive of profits and speculative gains. Neoliberals such as Gary Becker, discussed below, define the firm's high salaries and bonuses as returns to human capital. The National Income and Products Accounts, that is NIPA, N-I-P-A, depict all this charge as adding an equal value to the nation's product, quote unquote, of financial services. It all seems to be what Mr. Blankfein notoriously euphemized on another occasion as doing God's work of raising productivity. At issue is whether today's widening inequality between the wealthy and wage earners is justified or not. This question has been catapulted to the forefront of the news by the statistical researchers Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Sates, showing the increasing concentration of income in the hands of the richest 1%. The main remedies they propose are a wealth tax, particularly on inherited estates. And it would change everything if we could do it globally, and a return to steeper progressive income taxation. The idea of taxing higher income brackets more without regard for whether their gains are earned productively or in extractive rentier ways represents a victory in dissuading critics from focusing on the policy aim of Adam Smith and other classical economists, that is, preventing unearned income from being obtained in the first place. As Chapter 3 is described, they recognize not only that rentier revenue and capital gains is earned in a predatory and unproductive way, but also that land rent, monopoly rent, and financial charges are mainly responsible for the rising wealth of the 1%, as compared to that held by the rest of society. The turn of the 20th century saw wages rising, but most of the increase was paid to landlords via higher housing costs and to monopolists, bankers, and financiers. These rentier charges prevented wage earners from benefiting from wage gains that flowed through their hands to the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, that's the FIRE, the fire sector. What ultimately is important is how much remains for discretionary spending after meeting payments for real estate, debt service, and other basic needs. What's most unequal is the share in the economic surplus net of break-even subsistence costs, to the extent that labor or businesses only break even while income is concentrated in the hands of the fire sector and monopolies. The degree of inequality is much more pronounced than gross statistics indicate. Instead of treating rentier overhead as a charge against production and consumption, today's NIPA, National Income Product Account, depict rent extracting activities as producing a product, quote unquote. Fire sector revenue appears as a cost of producing an equivalent amount to GDP, gross domestic product, not as unearned income or empty pricing. And neither the NIPA nor the Federal Reserve's flow of funds statistics recognize how the economy's wealthiest financial layer makes its fortunes by land price gains and other capital gains. That I'll add that, there's capital gains all over the damn place, and much of it is unaccounted for or moved around, let's put it that way. There's a kind of shell game going on. A cloak of invisibility, thus, is drawn around how fire sector fortunes are amassed. And this idea, not simply as a metaphor, a cloak of invisibility, this is a virtual problem, and one that is really significant. And Piketty, is, among others, is really, one of the few to sort of scratch the surface and say, it's really all screwed up, and we really do have to structurally change things. J.B. Clark denies that rentier income is unearned. Well, that's pretty important too. The foundation myth of pro-rentier economics is that everyone receives income in proportion to the contribution they make to production. This denies that economic rent is unearned. There's this, mythical belief that equity exists and fairness exists, and this is not true. Hence, there is no exploitation or unearned income and no need for the reforms advocated by classical political economy. In America, the rejection of classical analysis was spearheaded by John Bates Clark, who lived from 1847 to 1938. Like nearly all American economists of the late 19th century, he had studied in Germany, where he absorbed the historical school's emphasis on public policy to shape markets. But upon returning to the United States, Clark became a critic of labor and socialism, finding his ultimate academic home at Columbia University, where he was from 1895 to 1923, a natural center for the reaction against classical rent theory. The journalist Henry George had attracted a large following among New York City's large Irish population, driven out of its home country by the depredations of British landlords, and almost was elected mayor in 1885 by proposing a land tax and public ownership of railroads and similar natural monopolies. Other immigrant communities brought Marxism and an advocacy for labor unionization with them to the States. The fight against absentee landlords merged naturally with denunciations of Wall Street. By the time Clark wrote The Distribution of Wealth in 1899, he was a full-fledged defender of rentier interests. His core message was that everyone earns what they deserve in proportion to their contribution to production. It is the purpose of this work, he wrote in its introduction, to show that the distribution of the income of society is controlled by a natural law, whatever that is. And this law, if it worked without friction, would give to every agent of production the amount of wealth which that agent creates. Sounds fine, sounds fair. The revenue of each recipient, euphemized as a factor of production, is assumed to be equal to the value they add to the product being sold, whether it takes the form of wages, profits, rent, or interest. Robber barons, landlords, and bankers are depicted as part of the production process, and prices are assumed to settle at their cost of production. This is that market clearing business, defined to include whatever rentiers manage to obtain. There's this assumption that it is there's something perfect about it, and it's clearly imperfect. This closed logical circle excludes any criticism that markets may work in an unfair way. To Clark and other free market economists, the market is simply the existing status quo, taking for granted the existing distribution of wealth and property rights. Any given distribution of property rights, no matter how inequitable, is thought of as just part of economic nature. The logic is that all income is earned by the recipient's contribution to production. It follows that there's no free lunch, and that also there is no alternative, to the extent that the existing distribution of wealth is a result of natural law. How tautological. Treating any revenue-yielding asset as capital conflates financial and rentier claims on production with the physical means of production. The vantage point is that of financiers or investors buying land and real estate, oil and mineral deposits, patents, monopoly privileges, and related rent extraction opportunities, without concern for whether economists classify their returns as profit or as rent. Today's tax laws make no such distinction. Clark's most trenchant critic was Simon Patten, Patten, the first economics professor at America's first business school, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. The defect of Professor Clark, he observed, was his failure to distinguish man-made capital from property rights that did not involve any necessary or intrinsic cost of production. Ultimately, that's the kind of thing on which it hinges, right? Property rights. The result, Patten said, was to conflate profits earned on tangible industrial capital investment with land and monopoly rent. And they're not identical. Monopoly rent is not the same as land. It's not the same as industrial capital investment. To real estate investors or farmers buying properties on mortgage, the financial and monopoly charges built into their acquisition price appear as an investment cost. And remember, a lot of these issues are accounting issues. The farmer thinks that land values depend on actual or real costs because he had to pay good money for his property, explained Patton. And the city land speculator has the same opinion as to town lots in towns. This individualistic view is antithetical to the socialist and progressive era reforms being introduced in the late 19th century. That is what makes classical concerns with the economics of national development different from the financialized investor's view of the world. At issue was what constitutes the cost of production in terms of real values, as distinct from extractive rentier charges. So, we've already made a distinction between these two things. Freeing economies from such charges seemed to be the destiny of industrial capitalism. So you could say that there's a kind of modernist bias built into this. That progress was Promethean and blah, blah, blah. Institutionalist and sociological reformers retained rent theory. Patton pointed out that land sites, like mineral rights provided by nature and financial privileges provided by legal fiat, do not require labor to create. You just stake your claim, etc. Put up a sign. But instead of describing their economic rent as an element of price without real cost or labor effort, Clark viewed whatever amount investors spent on acquiring such assets as their capital outlay, and hence as a market cost of doing business. According to the economic data he presents, Patton wrote, rent in the economic sense, if not fully disregarded, at least receives no emphasis. Land seems to just be a form of capital, its value, like other property, being due to the labor put upon it. Back to Locke, for example. But its price simply capitalizes property rights and financial charges that are not intrinsic. So Professor Patton is observing, Professor Clark has a skillful way of hiding land values by subserving them under the general concept of capital, Patton observed elsewhere. But if the doctrine of physical valuation is once introduced, the public will soon be educated to the evils of watered land values, that is, the watering down or diffusion of land values, and railroad rates. By doctrine of physical valuation, he meant the classical analysis of real costs of production in contrast to what his contemporaries called fictitious costs, such as land rent, watered stocks, and other political or institutional charges unnecessary for production to take place. Watered stocks, for example, you just issue more stock. And in fact, Trump just did that with Truth Social a while back, around the same time it went public. Rent is obtained by owners of land, not as a right based on economic considerations, because land and monopoly rights are not real factors of production, but are claims for payments levied as access charges to land, credit, or basic needs. That is, ultimately from the lack of supply of some needed article, Patton explained. Although the case of land is not the only example where there is an unearned increment because the price of food is always more than its cost of production on the best land, yet it is the best example and hence is the one in common use as an illustration. So, this idea that the bounty of the earth, et cetera, land and food production, et cetera, and, Malthus, blah, blah, blah. For national economies, the problem is that land rent and natural resource rent are taken at the expense of wage earnings as well as from industrial profits. It seems to me, Patton wrote, that the doctrine of Professor Clark, if carried out logically, would deny that the laborers have any right to share in the natural resources of the country. All the increase of wealth due to fertile fields or productive mines would be taken gradually from workmen with the growth of population and given to more favored persons. When it is said that the working man under these conditions gets all he is worth to society, the term society, if analyzed, means only the more favored classes. So already you have class division, class struggle. They pay each laborer only the utility of the last laborer to them and get the whole produce of the nation minus this amount. This is a way of accounting where you count only the value of the last thing acquired. This is why Patton's contemporary reformers urge that land, natural resources, and monopolies be kept in the public domain so as to minimize the rake-off of national patrimony given to more favored persons, whoever they are. The idea of unearned income as a subtraction from the circular flow of income available for labor and industry as wages and profits has vanished from today's post-classical NIPA. Now, that is today, whatever is paid to rentiers is considered a bona fide cost, bona fide cost of doing business, as if it embodies intrinsic value for a product. So we just labor under certain assumptions. Clark's claim that no income is unearned defines all economic activities as being productive in proportion to how much income they obtain. No one way of making money is deemed more or less productive than any other. Everyone earns just what he or she deserves. Natural law will proportion income and wealth to their recipient's contribution to production if it's not interfered with. So this idea is that, oh, well, just the way it is, sort of thing. This underlies a whole variety of individualist theories that, this is the way it is. Gary Becker, the University of Chicago economist, followed this logic in justifying such income as being earned productively, warning that progressive taxation would discourage their enterprise and hence productivity. A highly progressive income tax structure tends to discourage investment in human capital because it reduces take-home pay and the reward to highly skilled, highly paid occupations. Rentier income, inherited wealth, landlords, and monopolies making money off the economy is thus interpreted as earnings, quote unquote, earnings on one's human capital, quote unquote. This is the Gary Becker thing, the thing for which he got his Nobel Prize. The neoliberal catch-all residual to absorb whatever cannot be explained in terms of actual labor, effort, or costs. It replaces what former economists called unearned income. It is as if the 1% and the FIRE sector, F-I-R-E sector, do not make money off the property they have, either inherited or built up far beyond what anyone's individual labor and enterprise could explain, but out of their own human talents. This is Trump talking about his uncle at MIT. Finance capital, rentier capital, land and monopoly rights are all conflated with capital. So these are all sort of subsets of this general thing called capital. And you can see that definitionally this can become problematic. To depict an economy bifurcated between earned and unearned income, it is necessary to distinguish interest and economic rent from wages and profit, to trace the flow of payments from production and consumption to the FIRE sector and other rentier sectors. This discussion recently has been revived as it applies to banking, siphoning off the circular flow of production and consumer spending. This is the next section. All national income accounts since the tableau économique are based on the idea of circular flow, recognition that one party's spending is another person's revenue. Since Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, discussion of the circular flow of spending and consumption has been framed in terms of Say's law, named for the facile French economist Jean-Baptiste Say, S-A-Y. His law of markets is standard textbook teaching, usually paraphrased as production creates its own demand. Workers spend their paychecks on the goods they produce, while industrial employers invest their profits on capital goods to expand their factories and employ more labor to buy yet more products. This is it's this kind of a circularity argument that, and yes, Say's law could be applied at one level, but it's a kind of experimental assumption, but it's often sort of presumed that it's some kind of natural law, especially in the introductory textbook. But buying a property, stock, or bond does not involve hiring labor or financing production. Neither Say's law nor national income accounts distinguish between spending on current production and asset markets, or between productive and unproductive labor, earned and unearned income. Today's NIPA, the NIPA, thus fail to address how financial and allied rentier overhead imposes austerity. Say's law simply states that the precondition for economies to operate without business cycles or debt deflation draining income to pay a rentier class. The reality is that debt service and rent payments rise, extracting income from markets and preventing them from buying what they produce. This is the key point, is that debt and credit are the bigger issues in this context. It doesn't clear, it doesn't sort of, demand just doesn't naturally follow. There are glitches in this whole system, including things like debt service and rent payments, and they do exist. You can't explain, you'd love to explain them away or assume they don't exist, but they do exist. To operate without them is just insane. Most economics professors discuss Say's law simply to explain why it doesn't work to maintain full employment. That's they do a graph and you can see, why there are gaps in the system. Keynes worried that as economies grew richer, people would save a larger proportion of their income instead of spending on consumption. This is a problematic assumption generally. This drain from the circular flow would lead to depression unless governments compensated by infusing money into the economy, hiring labor for public works. There's a very simple model in terms of the 1930s that, particularly in Keynes's comments on, Keynes is writing, while there's this huge, hyperinflation in Germany and all this other terrible deprivation. It's clear that you needed some kind of fiscal policy. You needed government to go in and do something. And this is kind of why this was important. Keynes depicted saving simply as hoarding, withdrawing revenue from the spending stream of production and consumption. But what actually happens is that the savers lend to debtors while banks create new endogenous credit at interest. If you can see kind of what goes on here, this is about, the bank interventions that are not identical to what the central bank does. When repayment time arrives, that is when consumers have to start paying down their credit card balances and homeowners pay down mortgages without taking out new loans, saving takes the form of reducing debt. So it's not hoarding, you're paying down debt. A negation of a negation, it's interesting how he puts that there, is counted as a positive. And in this case, negating debt is defined as saving. This sets in motion an exponentially rising rake-off of financial returns from the real economy. So like we were talking, about in our prior discussion about compounding interest, et cetera, there's other issues going on here. Next section, value-free monetary theory of prices. Mainstream monetary theory, likewise, is narrowed to exclude transactions in assets and payments to the FIRE sector. Now, there's a little algebra here. All money, M, credit, and income, as assumed to be spent only on goods and service transactions, T, not on buying more real estate stocks and bonds or being lent out to indebt the economy. Economics students are taught this tautology, the MVPT tautology. Money times velocity equals prices times transactions. Now, this whole thing here is how it moves, how the economy moves, how things turn over, why they turn over. Because you have a quantity of money, it's times the velocity of money. That is the number of times per year money gets spent on real stuff. The P in this little equation, the equation of exchange, is that there's a price level and you multiply that times the total number of transactions in the economy, the total amount of real stuff we buy. And it seems relatively simple. You can do this for your own stuff on the one hand. On the other hand, once you start scaling it up, it gets a lot more complicated. But by far, most money and credit, M, is spent on real estate stocks, bonds, and bank loans. Every day, an entire year's worth of GDP passes through the New York Clearinghouse and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange for such asset transactions. assuming that changes in the money supply only affect commodity prices and wages, ignores the fact that T only refers to transactions in current output, not assets. So this is, it seems kind of transactional and it moves a lot, but doesn't really account for the larger system of assets. When this fails to work in practice, any errors and omissions are swept up into V, velocity of turnover, whatever that means, a residual determined by whatever M, P, and T leave out of account. Now, note that this is MV equals PT, the quantity of money times the velocity of money equals the price level of the stuff we buy times the total number of transactions in the economy. And it all seems kind of logical, but it isn't really. There's something else that's going on. There's always an economic gain for some party in sponsoring bad theory. Many erroneous economies can be traced to policies endorsed by the bad theorists. And yet we still teach them. Leaving rentier income and spending out of the equation enables anti-labor economists to demand monetary austerity and a balanced government budget as their knee-jerk policy response. Now, we get this every year, right? Where the government could shut down in a couple of weeks, and then there's comments on balancing the budget and other stuff, which is just it's amusing, but illusory. Let's put it that way. The narrow-minded MV equals PT tautology enables economists to blame wages for inflationary pressures. So it is the point of view of management to say, well, you're just asking for too much money. You're not being efficient enough or whatever. And it just doesn't account for all the stuff that's taken out of your paycheck and blah, blah, blah. Not the cost of living being pushed up by debt-leveraged housing prices and other fire sector expenses, or by the rising corporate debt service built into the pricing of goods and services. You see, this would disappear, or not disappear, but it would be absorbed under socialism. But, people don't want to talk about that because it's whatever, it's got cooties. In reality, asset prices rise or fall at a different rate from commodity prices and wages. This is a result precisely of the fact that the Federal Reserve and other central banks inject money into the economy via Wall Street, the City of London, or other financial centers by buying and selling treasury securities or providing commercial bank reserves. For example, in the post-2008 waves of quantitative easing. It's all about liquidity. Money injection is necessary. I mean, if you didn't, you'd get all this, you get stagnation and then ultimately depression and a recession, et cetera. Monetary injections affect asset prices by influencing the interest rate. Central bank purchases of government bonds bid up their price. The higher price lowers the interest yield, is the inverse ratio, interest yield, I, on government securities or whatever the central bank may buy, and this affects asset prices in general. The interest rate is used to discount the income flow of a bond, rental property, or dividend-paying stock. At 5% rate of interest, the income yielding asset would be 20 times earnings. At 4%, 25 times earnings, and so forth. It's a simple, we sort of, you can appreciate that in our prior discussion about interest rates and compound interest, et cetera. National income accounts exclude rent extraction and financial drains. The NEPA were created in the 1930s and World War II to help keep inflationary pressures in check by comparing wages and profits to the flow of output, not to focus on the rentier dynamics weighing down modern economies. So the point was, of course, is to try and keep the economy rolling along. The rentier dynamics, people ignored them simply because you had a war to run. You had the economy to fix. And so a lot of this was ignored in terms of government central planning or national economy planning, but a different way. Failure to isolate the fire sector and rentier overhead has led national income accounting into a quandary. And I included a section in here because I did a little, AI thing. And maybe I'll read that. We may not get to chapter 7. The fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, and rentier overhead, that is income derived from ownership of assets rather than productive activities, this is coupon clipping, have become increasingly significant components of modern economies. However, their unique nature and the challenges in accurately measuring their contributions have led to a quandary in national income accounting. Key issues and challenges: overestimation of economic activity. Now we'll stop here for a second and remind everyone that Marx has a theory of crisis, and much of this crisis is sort of overproduction or underconsumption or a variety of other things that cause crisis. And so this is part of trying to consider this. Financialization is a key element. The growth of the fire sector, often driven by speculation and financial engineering, can inflate national income figures without corresponding increases in real economic output. Rentier income derived from asset ownership, such as dividends, interest, and capital gains, can be counted as economic output, even though it doesn't represent value added through production. And this is the fundamental point, right? Rentier income is not, quote unquote, productive, even though it is being, without overindulging the semantics, even though it's being produced. So this is the kind of semantic problem you want to sort of get over. Underestimation of costs, negative externalities. This is a big deal relative to things like the environment. The fire sector, FIRE, sector and rentier activities can generate negative externalities such as financial instability, income inequality, and environmental degradation. Those are all negative externalities. You usually learn this in your microeconomics class. These costs are often not adequately captured in the national income accounts. Resource misallocation, excessive focus on the fire sector and renter activities can lead to a misallocation of resources away from productive sectors, hindering long-term economic growth. You can argue, there's a social cost to military goods as well, for example. Now, the issue here, and this is why I put it in here, is about measurement difficulties. Circular flows, the complex financial transactions within the fire sector can create circular flows of income, making it difficult to accurately measure net economic output. Shadow economy, and this is probably the first time I've mentioned this, but I've talked about it in the context of the informal economy. That is, there's other things that go on. Rentier activities, particularly those involving illicit or tax avoidance strategies, crime, corruption, may not be fully captured in official statistics, leading to an underestimate of the sector's size and impact. Now, what are the implications for economic policy? Well, you get misguided policy decisions. That is, inaccurate national income accounting can lead to misguided economic policy, such as an excessive reliance on financialization or adequate regulation of the fire sector. Inequality and social unrest, the growing dominance of the fire sector and renter activities can contribute to rising income inequality and social unrest. That's kind of what Piketty is suggesting. Long-term economic growth, a failure to address the challenge posed by the fire sector and rentier overhead can hinder long-term economic growth and development. That's, there's this is largely a generalization brought to you by Gemini. Now, to address these challenges, there are various ways of approaching it. There, you can revise the national income accounting measures, which, this is an important issue and truly one that would be a sea change. That is, developing new measures that better capture the non-productive aspects of financial activities and rentier income. Increasing regulation, that is, implementing stricter regulations to curb excessive speculation and financialization. Not in a GOP administration. Tax reforms, reforming tax systems to discourage rentier activities and incentivize productive investment and public investment, increasing public investment in sectors that promote long-term economic growth and development. So the point here is, of course, this all seems like it's doable, but you can see how difficult it has been to fix certain problems that would probably be really have an important contribution to growth and the efficiency of the economy. So back to Hudson. Instead of estimating economic rent, the NEPA counts it as earnings for making a contribution to gross domestic product. We mentioned this before. Rentiers appear to earn their income by producing a product, quote unquote, equal in value to the rents they collect. Now, this is all illusory, right? It's only measured in, money, whatever that is, right? If landlords charge more rent, real estate product rises, of course. If Goldman Sachs and other bankers charge their clients more for financial services or make money by winning arbitrage bond trades against them or other counterparties supposed to pay themselves more, their financial product, quote unquote, is counted as rising accordingly. The assumption is that people only receive income for what they produce. So this is how the concept of product or producing has expanded or has been not misapplied, but is kind of spongy or flexible in that sense, adjustable. This assumption based on a tunnel vision that reflects the ideological victory that landlords and vested financial interests achieved in the late 19th century against the classical drive to tax economic rent. The effect of excluding land rent, natural resource rent, and monopoly rent, the drain of income from producers and consumers to pay landlords, privatizers, monopolists, and their bankers, is to deter measurement of what I call, this is Hudson, call rent deflation. That is the analog to debt deflation, the diversion of income to pay debt service. This is the whole deal about, worrying about the cost of servicing debt, which always gets lip service. But since a fair number of people don't know what that means, it tends to be lost in those talking points in every election year. There's also no measure of criminal income, smuggling, or fictitious accounting for tax avoidance. No category of spending is counted as overhead, not even pollution cleanup costs or crime prevention, not to mention financial bailouts. Economists dismiss these as externalities. Well, it's just whatever. It's out there, meaning external to the statistics deemed relevant. It's like, oh, well, we just don't think about that. Yet, despite the rising proportion of spending that takes the form of rent extraction, environmental pollution cleanup costs, debt pollution, and its bailout costs, GDP is treated as an accurate measure of economic welfare. And this is just the way it currently is. It appears natural, but it obviously isn't. The result confuses healthy growth with that of a tumor on the body politic. Taken together, these emissions deter the kind of systemic analysis that would have alerted policymakers and voters to the distortions leading up to the 2008 crash. Now, treating economic rent as earnings. The word rent appears only once in the NEPA and is to reflect neither what most people imagine rent to be, nor the classical concept of economic rent. In fact, it is not even any transaction that actually is paid or received. It is, quote unquote, imputed homeowners' rent. That is the amount that homeowners would have to pay if you rented your own home, right? It's an index of some kind, but it's, the reality is pretty wacky, right? You want to think of how much, if I were going to rent this out to somebody, how much would be paid? And it's just, it's an imaginary number in the sense that, it represents some value, but it's a value that's probably not even manipulated. But obviously it's used for other things, right? To, take out loans and blah, blah, blah. No cash changes hands in this valuation. The NEPA include this imputed non-payment because enjoying one's home is part of the economy's product. Less than 2% of GDP and falling. This is, more of these things that appear to be prosperity. This is not classical economic rent. Rental income obtained by commercial investors and natural resource owners is called earnings, on a par with profits and wages. This diverts attention away from how fortunes are made without labor or out-of-pocket production costs. It also requires a convoluted reorganization of statistics to discover how large the actual cash flow return to absentee real estate ownership actually is, given the heavy component of interest and the just pretend economic category of overdepreciation. Fred Harrison, the British economics journalist, summarizes how economists have confused the burgeoning land rent with the much more modest imputed homeowner's self-rental estimate. The successful strategy at euphemistic confusion has made its way euphemistic confusion has made its way into today's leading textbooks as if it represents land rent for the economy as a whole. The most famous school text of its day. Yes, I think I had edition 12 or whatever. Economics by Paul Samuelson and William Nordhaus reports that rent income of persons is less than 2% of gross national product, GNP, and falling steadily over the last half century. A more recent textbook by Paul Krugman and Robin Wells states that rent constitutes only 1% of U.S. national income. This obviously would be too trivial for a century of classical political economy to bother to analyze, not to mention urging that it serve as a tax base. Land rent appears to have disappeared into the Orwellian memory hole. It is as if commercial real estate investors and owners receive no land rent at all. This terminological sleight of hand helped divert attention from how bank overlending led to the real estate bubble that burst in 2008. Excuse me. It also trivializes international trade theory by failing to recognize how capitalizing land rent into mortgage loans raises the cost of housing and other debt leverage prices. What the NEPA does make clear is that most real estate rental income is paid to the banks as interest. NEPA accountants find real estate and banking are so intertwined in the symbiotic FIRE sector, F-I-R-E sector, that for many years, financial and real estate income was not separated in the statistic. The activities of mortgage brokers and real estate agents seem to belong to finance, insurance, or real estate in common. They just all sort of merge together. Well, that's actually very dangerous, and from a role and from a definitional point of view. The NEPA also showed that the tax fiction of over-depreciation, that is writing off a building more than once and over again, offsets otherwise taxable earnings for commercial real estate, enabling commercial real estate, oil, and mining companies to operate decade after decade without a reportable taxable profit. And this has to do with, dry wells, exploration costs and the mining on the mining side. It's just, this is a sleight of hand. An army of accountants has been backed by political lobbyists to write loopholes, a euphemism for distorting economic reality, into the tax code to make it appear that landlords and oil companies lose money, not make it. According to the NEPA, real estate earnings do not cover the rate at which landlords pay interest as the cost of production and buildings depreciate. This is, the Trump, the king of debt. Depreciation and the rate of return. The next section. For industrial capital that wears out or obsolesces, that is becoming high cost as a result of improving technology. For example, computers that quickly get out of date, even though they remain in working order. This is the issue of, computing speed, capability, and operating systems that always need to be updated. Depreciation is a return of capital and hence not part of surplus value, strictly speaking. But this is not the case in real estate because buildings do not wear out. And rather than their technology becoming obsolete, older buildings tend to have much more desirable construction or also have been renovated as a result of the ongoing maintenance repairs that typically absorb about 10% of rental income or a property's equivalent rental value. So, for real estate, depreciation is largely a fictitious category of income designed to make rental revenue tax-free. The same building can be depreciated all over again at a rising price each time the property is sold to a commercial investor. This is, a kind of turnover, but not identical. Homeowners are not allowed this tax subsidy. Thus, despite the pretense by accountants that real estate is losing its value, the land site value, and in fact, this is the difference between ground rent and, rent. And the decline in interest rates actually is increasing its value. Reality and seemingly empirical statistics tell opposite stories. No wonder the wealthiest 1% have widened their wealth gap over the rest of the economy, defining this just pretend statistical picture as if it is empirical science and therefore objective simply because its deception has decimal points. Ha! Classical economics is free of such pretenses and rentier tax favoritism. What actually happens is that landlords, oil and gas companies, mining companies, monopolies, and banks charge rents for access to the land, natural resources, and credit needed for production to actually take place. Now, these payments drain the circular flow of spending between producers and consumers, shrinking markets and causing unemployment. And note gasoline prices, right? Rentiers spend their income not only to hire labor and buy its products, as Malthus described, and as Keynes applauded, but also to buy financial assets and more property. Banks use their revenue to make more loans. This creates yet more debt while bidding up asset prices, obliging new homeowners to borrow even more for ownership rights. Real estate price gains largely reflect rising site values for land magnified by bank credit at rising debt leveraged ratios, that is, capitalizing rental value into mortgage loans at falling rates of interest. You can see how this operates. It creates a kind of false dynamism that allows you to keep moving stuff. These price gains far overshadow actual rental income and are taxed at much lower rates than wages and profit. Yet the Federal Reserve's flow of funds accounts have no statistic for price increases for real estate stocks and bonds, or for that matter, for speculative winnings by arbitrageurs, and other gamblers. In some sense, the Fed, we shouldn't care about that. The SEC should care about that or something, whatever. So anyway, Chapter 11 will discuss debt financed asset price inflation in detail. Without a measure of such price gains, one cannot calculate total returns, defined as current income plus asset price gains. In short, the NEPA are not really a model of how economies work and how fortunes are made in this today's world. Instead, the NEPA provide a cloak of invisibility. Remember, we talked about that at the front end, for rent extracting activities. The NEPA and the invisibility of rent extracting activities. So I did a little Gemini thing. It masks rent extraction. It differentiates, you have to differentiate between income versus rent, asset appreciation, transfer payments, financial sector, and why invisibility makes this work better. Well, you don't see it. You don't see what things are or are not sustainable. And so how would we fix this? You could fix it with revised national income measures. Now, you really have to work to, firm it up, make it more specific. We have computers, so this is really not as big a deal as it used to be. Increase regulation, that is, implement stricter regulation to curb rent-seeking activities and promote fair competition. Duh. Tax reforms, reforming tax system to discourage rent seeking and incentivize productive investment and public investment. The big deal, the bigger deal, increasing public investment in sectors that promote long-term economic growth and development. So I sort of bashed through that a little faster. The vested interests have won the fight against creating more relevant statistical categories. And their hope, evidently, is that if exploitative activities are not seen or quantified, they're less likely to be taxed or regulated. Ha! Does the financial sector produce a product or subrahend, that is, subsume or make secondary from GDP? Today's major rentier sector is banking and high finance. Most bank loans are geared not to produce goods and services, but to transfer ownership rights for real estate, stocks, including those of entire companies, and bonds. This has led national income theory. This is the why Code of Capital is a good book. This had, because it points out there's all this other shit going on. This has led national income theorists to propose treating the revenue of such institutions as transfer payments, not payments for producing output or product. Now, that's a distinction without a difference. So I put in a little thing. I asked Gemini to sort of solve this problem. Transferring ownership rights can be both productive and a product. It facilitates market exchange, encourages investment, promotes innovation. But the reality is that it's a kind of, legal documents. It's about the law, right? Deeds, contracts, stock certificates. And so production, in one sense, is just producing paper, but really powerful paper. And then service, of course, it is in motion in that sense, and there is turnover, as it were. In conclusion, while transferring ownership rights is often seen as a necessary and productive economic activity, it can also be considered a product or service in its own right. Australian economist Brian Haig has called this the banking problem. If financial services were actually treated like other industries, he writes, the banking sector as a whole would be depicted as making a negligible or even negative contribution to national economic output, as being effectively unproductive. Updating this discussion of how best to describe financial services in the national income accounts, Brett Christophers, who's done stuff on fictitious capital, asks, what service, if any, is actually being rendered by the banks here? At issue are situations where payments are made, but production is not considered to have taken place. As Britain's 2006 National Accounts reports noted, such payments do not represent any addition to current economic activity. The Clark-like neoclassical view assumes that, well, if somebody pays a fee, they must be getting a product. Treating bank payments as a subtrahend or simply as a cost of transferring wealth without affecting production is anomalous to today's mainstream. The concept of unproductive labor or unearned income that was at the core of classical economics has disappeared. As Christophers explains, national accounts economists of the mid to late 20th century could not see anything but paradox in the notion that such a prosperous industry as banking, with such self-evident utility, either detracted from the national output or added only marginal value to it. A negative or nil output was unacceptable because from the neoclassical perspective, it literally made no sense. Raising the banking problem thus poses a threat to post-classical economic doctrine. There is no category in the NEPA for income obtained without contributing an equivalent amount to national product. Remember, this is not, beans are not being counted. We have computers now. We don't have to have this kind of thing. Finance and rent seeking appear as part of the economic growth process, not parasitic and external to it. This explains why the NEPA exclude capital gains from rising prices for land and other real estate stocks and bonds. They have the same effect as income, raising the net worth of owners, and are mainly responsible for building up fortunes over the past half century, especially since 1980. But they're incompatible with the facile income equals product assumption used to rationalize and justify rent or income so as to save it from being taxed, as classical economists urge. Making asset price inflation statistically invisible helps deter public pressure to tax real estate and financial gains at the same rate as normal income, as originally was the case in the U.S. tax code. So how is it that we could measure what we were just mentioning before, rent your overhead? Well, it's complicated, right? Rent your overhead refers to income, this Gemini stuff, refers to income derived from ownership of assets rather than productive activities. Measuring it accurately is a complex task due to the diverse nature of rentier activities and the challenges in distinguishing between productive and non-productive income. Key challenges in measurement. Well, how do you define rentier income? This is, it can have both productive and non-productive stuff. How is it that you distinguish productive from non-productive? It's unclear and deliberately. Data limitations, access to accurate and comprehensive data on asset ownership, income flows, the nature of economic activities can be limited. It doesn't have to be, making it difficult to construct reliable measures of rentier overhead. These are just the areas that people avoid. As I said, there are computers. This is not a big deal anymore. Evasion and tax avoidance, rentier activities, particularly those involving illicit or tax avoidance strategies, may not be fully captured in official statistics, leading to an underestimate of the sector's size and impact. And then there are potential challenges, asset ownership data, income distribution data, stuff that is measurable. Just, no one wants to measure it for X number of reasons, because if you could identify it, then you could tax it. Economic rent, residual income, and hybrid approaches that combine direct and indirect measures. And how is it that we can model it? We could model it by simulating the impact of different assumptions about rentier activities. And, it's just a standard problem. It's not, they've chosen to ignore this data. It doesn't make the data any bigger in a larger picture, because that's why we have the cloud, et cetera, big data. It's just infinite in that sense. Today's economic accounts ignore the classical economic focus on rentier overhead. Keynesian macroeconomics traces the circular flow among sectors without analyzing intrinsic value or the classical concern for invested labor, quote unquote, or how revenue is obtained. Instead, a seemingly empirical statistical picture pretends that the fire sector plays a productive role in helping economies grow and prosper. Truly a fire festival. Here's the problem. If all income is obtained as part of the production process and spent on buying goods and services, as Clark and his followers claim, there's no diversion of spending away from economic growth. But what about income spent on assets, loans, or debt payments? So you have this other thing. At issue is defining what constitutes economic growth. This is Hudson. In reality versus under today's measurement concepts, a rising portion of economic activity does not have to do with production, that is investment and output, or consumption, but with buying and selling property already in place. And we just talked about that before, continually reassessing it. Primarily real estate, the largest assets, natural resources, stocks and bonds. A recent book, GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History, notes how irrational this measure is for the financial sector. In view of the negative output of an imaginary segment of the economy, the GDP measure greatly exaggerates the importance of financial services to overall economic output. Perversely, in the final quarter of 2008, Britain's banking industry showed its fastest growth on record, almost matching manufacturing in size, just as the money markets all but froze. Treating the creation of largely fictitious, unpayably high financial claims on the economy as if this adds to output and wealth leaves out of account the massive public bailouts needed to sustain the banking sector. And this is, we're on to the doorstep of modern monetary theory. The external economic costs are a form of debt pollution. When somebody confidently quotes the contribution of financial services to national income, writes Financial Times columnist John Kay, you can be sure they have no understanding of the esoteric concept of financial services indirectly measured. Don't ask. Only a few people in the depths of national statistics offices do. This problem casts doubt on the validity of reported growth rates, both before and after the crisis. In a similar vein, Eve Smith notes the effect of periodic crises. Andrew Haldane of the Bank of England, using a simple back-of-the-envelope analysis, concluded there was no way for banks to even remotely pay for all the damage they produce in terms of lost output. The GDP's report of the financial sector's economic contribution and services doesn't account for risk. Before the 2008 crisis, banks' increased risk-taking and leverage was counted as growth in GDP. Since then, studies have shown that adjusting for risk-taking would reduce financial sector contributions to GDP by 25 to 40%. As a result, the financial sector contribution to GDP is largely a statistical mirage. The resulting system of seemingly empirical statistics leads to confusion about what actually is happening in the economy. As Alan Greenspan summarized, if you just look at GDP statistics, you miss the bubble altogether. So the question is, if you can't stop a bubble, what do? Fortunately, most bubbles are not toxic. The dot-com boom, when it collapsed, you can't find it in the GDP figures in 2001, 2002. It didn't happen. It is unfortunate. The 1987 crash, with the Black Thursday or whatever the hell it was, which was really the most horrendous thing. I defy you to find that in the GDP numbers. It's just not there. Yes, there were huge capital losses, but to the people who made the capital gains, essentially, what a realistic set of national accounts should show is that instead of using their wealth to invest in producing more to raise living standards, the 1% lend out their savings at interest to extract revenue from wage earners, real estate, industry, and government, shrinking the economy instead of expanding it. Most financial transactions now take place with other financial institutions, largely in the form of computerized bets, derivatives. People got Nobel Prizes for this math. Calculating risk on which way interest rates and exchange rates or stock and bond prices will move. One party's gain is another's loss, and the overall system ends up needing to be bailed out by government. So it's kind of a zero-sum sort of thing here. But instead of simply creating the money to pay everybody off, central bank managers insist that labor and industry must pay by raising taxes on the real economy to pay for the financial sector's losses on the pretense that the financial sector is what is making the economy richer, not poorer, and that austerity, that is poverty for the 99% will be a cure mainly for the fact that the 1% do not yet control all the wealth. Just wait, they will soon. Peter Thiel. The guiding principle of today's official statistical model seems to be that if people don't see unearned wealth explicitly labeled as overhead, if there is no measure of how much output the fire sector and monopolies siphon off, voters will be less likely to advocate regulating or taxing. Nothing to see here. The concept of parasitic activity in which one party's gains or another's loss is cynically excluded from government accounting formats. This numbing of the obvious has enabled the vested interest to gain control of society's statistical sensory system that's supposed to guide its economic planning, tax policy, and resource allocation. So we're back to the strategy of financial parasitism. In order to extract the economy's surplus in the form of rent and interest, it's necessary to convince people that the fire sector makes a contribution to the real economy, keeping up with the income its recipients get. The NEPA defend land rent, interest, and other financial rents and monopoly rents as contributing to output, not extraneous to the real economy, extracting parasitic transfer payments. The rentier free lunch is depicted as a contribution to national income and product, not as a subtrahend, that is, a transfer payment from the 99% to the 1%. The idea that interest, rent, and price gouging are a burdensome overhead disappears. You know, and of course, as illusory as it might be, it's still important to make the proposal, and that is Kamala Harris making some comment about prosecuting price gouging. Well, good luck with that. Little of this financial revenue is spent back into the real economy of production or consumption. Most is simply recycled into the acquisition of yet more property, financial securities, or new loans. The banking system creates credit mainly to finance the purchase of rent-yielding assets, headed by real estate, oil, and mineral resources and monopolies. Banks lend out their receipt of interest as yet more mortgage credit to buyers of yet rent-yielding resources. The effect is to turn economic rent into a flow of interest payments, which expands exponentially. inflating asset prices, but also draining debt service from the economy. Paying land rent as interest leaves it unavailable as the tax base. So labor and industry must bear the burden. This is, cost shifting or burden shifting, raising the economy's cost of living and doing business. This wasn't how the financial sector was expected to evolve when the Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum. And it doesn't have to be the way today's post-industrial finance capitalism develops. Alternatives were advocated in the 19th century to mobilize finance to fund capital investment in production and public infrastructure. But after World War I, financial interests, Wall Street, joined with property interests to shift the tax burden off themselves onto labor and industry by promoting an illusion that rent and interest are payments for productive services and even deserved special breaks. So I'm going to stop right there. I know that, I could yammer on, but I've covered chapter 6, and I hope you got something out of it. It seems pretty clear that, we're not explaining it away. We're just, pointing out that we should start measuring stuff that is measurable. It's not unmeasurable. It's just being ignored deliberately because people want to, it's greed or whatever. It's sort of out of sight, out of mind. It's a veil. It is its own money veil. So it's sort of money veil 2 or whatever, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, so Otay, are there questions? Brickbats.
To me, it's outright deception.
Oh, it is. It is deception. It's like, don't measure that. So, it's not important. That's not it. Not it at all. Thank you, Anna. Trump is about to solve all problems regarding money, announcing his new crypto exchange. God, he is clueless about this. Bitcoin, he's doing this whole sucking up to the Bitcoin people. It's just insane. And we all love externalities. Russian oligarchs made billions in London rent. That's it. That is precisely it. That is exactly, it's all about property. And as we've noted, Bill Gates and property and Bezos, I assume, has bought tons of property all over the place, buying islands here and there, and, Larry Ellison, blah, blah, blah. Clueless equals the perfect consultant, indeed. Okay, so a lot of arm waving I did, but I hope it will get you to sort of read it with a bit of attention to those kinds of matters. Are there any brickbats or comments? At the top of the hour is the writing workshop. So other things are happening. Anyone? Okay. I do hope this is actually important stuff. This is stuff that, somebody else is going to do this. No, actually it's a political intervention that needs to happen. And yes, it might bring socialism, but you don't sell it that way. It's just simply to account for stuff that is hurting people. I mean, you just think of it as a cost, and much of it cannot be explained away or assumed away, which is the other part of the problem. It's really trying to make people more accountable for the total production of wealth. Okie dokie. Let me, since I have control over the whatever, I will, in fact, shut the live stream down so we can all say frack or frell or flipping. Come on.